Discovery. I always thought I knew my husband. 10 years together, all the plans, the routines, the promises, I thought I could read him like an open book. But sometimes, people hide more than you could ever imagine, and when you discover it, nothing is the same again. It started small. He began staying late at work more often. At first, I believed him. Important projects, he would say, and I would nod, trying not to sound suspicious. Then came the late-night calls. A phone always clutched tightly in his hand, disappearing when I walked by. I tried to convince myself. Don't be paranoid. We trust each other. 10 years of trust, and this is just work stress. But one morning, everything changed. I was cleaning out his wallet, just a habit I had, and I saw a slip of paper. A name I didn't recognize. A number. And a tiny note scribbled beneath it. Can we meet tonight? My chest tightened. My vision blurred. I wanted to throw the paper, scream, call him out, but instead, I felt my body go still. I knew that one moment of calm was more powerful than 1,000 words of anger. He was right there, in the kitchen, sipping his coffee, smiling like nothing had happened. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him. I didn't run. I simply started observing. The first week was the hardest. Every action, every word, every glance, I noted them all. He thought I didn't notice the way his eyes lingered on the phone, the way he cleared his browser history, the way he avoided specific details when I asked about his day. I began running little tests. I asked him random questions about his meetings, expecting him to answer casually. He stumbled over details once or twice. I arrived home early one day, unannounced, just to see what he would do. He acted normal, but I noticed the tension in his shoulders. Then I found the text messages. Not on his phone, he had started deleting them, but on the tablet he kept in the living room. A pattern. A series of messages between him and someone else, all carefully worded. He thought he was clever, hiding the truth in plain sight. But he wasn't careful enough. I remember sitting on the edge of our bed that night, holding the tablet, staring at the screen, heart pounding. Pain and relief mingled in a strange, confusing cocktail. Relief, because at least I knew. Pain, because there was no way to undo what I had just seen. I kept thinking back to the early days of our marriage. The promises we made, the dreams we shared. I had trusted him with my life, my heart, my world. And in a single line of text, someone else had stolen part of that. But anger wasn't my first reaction. No, it was clarity. I realized that my power hadn't disappeared, it had been waiting for me to claim it. And I would. Slowly, deliberately. I began planning, not for a public confrontation, not for dramatic revenge. I needed him to feel the weight of his choices, to realize that trust, once broken, could never return to exactly what it had been. Every day, I watched, learning his routines, his excuses, his habits. I noted which lies were small and which were dangerous. I also started preparing myself. I returned to things I had abandoned. Reading novels I loved but had stopped, jogging in the mornings, taking time for myself. I dressed better, not for him, but for me. I stopped checking the clock when he came home. I stopped pretending not to notice small inconsistencies. I was becoming someone who could stand on her own. And then, the moment came where I knew I could act. Not yet in full confrontation, but in observation, in planning, in subtle shifts that he wouldn't notice immediately. I wanted him to feel the uncertainty, the creeping realization that I was no longer the naive, trusting wife he thought I was. That the person he believed he could control had begun to reclaim herself. I watched him as he walked past me in the kitchen, smiling politely, completely unaware that I already knew everything. That smile, that casual confidence, it was the last he would have before reality hit him. That week, I didn't speak of it. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just sat, observing, planning, feeling a strange mixture of sorrow and power. And in that stillness, I made a promise. I will not be the victim of his lies. Not anymore. I will choose my next steps, and they will be mine. Because I realized something that night. True strength doesn't come from confrontation or revenge. It comes from understanding. From awareness. From taking back your own life before the other person even realizes what's happening. And that's what I would do. Slowly. Carefully. And when the moment came, he would understand, not through my words, but through my actions. Part 2. Observation. The days that followed were a strange mix of routine and tension. He acted as if nothing had changed, sipping his coffee, making small talk, sending the occasional "I love you" text. And yet, I could see it, just beneath the surface, a flicker of unease. He was trying to convince himself I didn't know. But I did. I knew every small lie, every careful word, every delayed response. I didn't confront him. Not yet. I needed him to feel safe first. People reveal the most when they think you're oblivious. I began observing more closely. The way he answered calls. The way he avoided looking me in the eye. The tone of his voice when he said he was working late. Small details I had ignored before became loud and clear. Every habit, every movement, every gesture told a story. One evening, I asked casually, "Do you still love me?" He laughed too quickly. "Of course. Why would you even ask that?" "Just wondering," I replied. Love doesn't defend itself in panic. I knew he felt guilty, and that guilt was a lever. I returned to things I had abandoned, reading, jogging, painting, spending time with friends. I dressed differently, not to make him jealous, not to flaunt, but to remind myself I still had a life beyond his deceit. I stopped asking questions about his day, stopped tracking his whereabouts. I was reclaiming my own world. And he noticed. He started arriving home earlier. He lingered in the living room, trying to engage me in small talk. He touched my hand with a little more hesitation than usual, as if testing the waters. I felt it, but I didn't react. I let him wonder what I knew, what I felt, what I was planning. He tried one night to corner me gently. "Everything okay? You've been different." I smiled. "Better than okay." That tiny crack in his confidence told me everything. People who betray rely on fear, fear that they can lose you. I had removed that fear. I was no longer afraid of him, and it shook him more than any confrontation could. I started planting subtle truths, small hints in conversations with friends or during casual mentions of my own schedule. Nothing accusatory. Nothing threatening. Just enough for him to realize the walls of his carefully constructed lies were crumbling. He asked more questions. Tried to steer conversations, probe my thoughts. I answered calmly, never revealing too much. The tension grew inside him like a storm he could feel but not stop. And I watched it silently, feeling the steady pulse of power return to me. One evening, as we sat across from each other over dinner, I said softly, "It's strange how fragile trust is. One small lie can shake everything." He paused mid-bite. His fork hovered in the air. "Do you ever think about that?" I continued. "About the choices people make when they think no one's watching?" He looked down at his plate, chewing slowly, avoiding my gaze. I didn't press. I didn't need to. The message had already been sent. In the following days, I began to test him in other ways. I'd ask him about meetings I knew were fake, mention events I hadn't attended, or casually refer to a conversation he hadn't had. He would stumble, hesitate, or give an answer too rehearsed. And every time, I felt a little surge of clarity and control. I also noticed changes in myself. I felt stronger, more present, more alive. I wasn't consumed by betrayal anymore. I was calculating, aware, and in charge. I had become someone who could face deception without losing herself. One night, I caught him checking his phone nervously as I walked past. He froze for a moment, and I felt no fear, no shock, only a calm acknowledgement. I knew then that the balance had shifted. He could no longer take for granted my trust or my attention. I started planning the next phase, the phase where the truth would be revealed, where the world he had hidden behind carefully constructed lies would collapse, not through confrontation, but through the awareness I had built. And as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized something profound. True power doesn't come from yelling, crying, or revenge. True power comes from observing, understanding, and choosing when and how to act. I wasn't angry anymore. I was patient. I wasn't weak. I was preparing. And when the moment came, he would see everything he had underestimated, and it would be undeniable. Part 3. The reveal. The next few days were tense, but nothing changed outwardly. He went about his work, smiled at me, kissed me on the cheek in the morning, but I could see it. The subtle shift in his posture, the flicker in his eyes, the way he avoided long silences. He knew I knew. And that knowledge weighed on him like a stone. I hadn't confronted him yet. I wanted him to feel safe, to believe that nothing was different. People reveal the most when they think the other person is oblivious. I let him sink into that false security while I quietly prepared my next steps. I began planting small reminders of truth, subtle questions about his day, casual comments about accountability, innocent mentions of honesty in conversations with friends or colleagues. Nothing direct, nothing aggressive. But each comment, each implication, was a crack in the wall of his carefully constructed lies. One evening, I invited him to a dinner at our apartment. I had invited a few colleagues of his, nothing fancy, just a casual meal. He was surprised but pleased. He liked showing off a happy domestic front. He didn't suspect that tonight would change everything. The dinner started normally. Wine, laughter, polite conversation. I made small talk with the guests, then slowly shifted the focus. Trust is a strange thing, I said, casually, while pouring wine. It's fragile, and yet we treat it like it's infinite. One lie, one secret, it can shake the entire foundation of a relationship. He looked at me, puzzled but still smiling politely. I continued. People think secrets protect relationships. They don't. Secrets protect lies. The room went quiet. Even the guests noticed the tension. He froze mid-sentence, eyes darting toward me. I didn't need to accuse him. I didn't need to name names. Because the truth was already there, sitting between us, unavoidable, heavy. After dinner, as the guests left, he stayed behind, silent. I poured 2 glasses of water and handed him one. He didn't speak at first. You know, don't you? He finally asked, voice low. Yes, I said. Calmly. He swallowed hard, struggling for words. He tried to explain, to minimize, to justify. I stopped him. This isn't about what you did, I said, meeting his eyes. It's about the choices you made. About the lies you thought were harmless. He asked if I was leaving. I shook my head. No, I said. I'm choosing. Choosing myself. That moment, I saw panic flicker across his face, not anger, not fear of punishment, but the dawning realization that he had lost control. Control over me, over my trust, over my world. And there was nothing he could do to get it back. In the following days, I continued to live my life fully. I took long walks, reconnected with old friends, spent time pursuing hobbies I had abandoned. Each step was deliberate, a reminder that I no longer needed him to define my existence. He tried small gestures, apologies, explanations, promises, but nothing could undo what had shifted. He realized that trust, once broken, is not a bridge that can be rebuilt overnight. It is a lesson, and I had already learned mine. One night, we sat across from each other in the living room. Silence stretched between us, but it was no longer heavy. It was tense, but honest. "You've changed," he said quietly. "I chose myself," I replied. He nodded slowly. The weight of understanding settled over him. Not through my words, not through accusations, but through the calm certainty in my eyes, the knowledge that I was no longer the person he could manipulate. And in that moment, I understood something crucial. True revenge is not about destroying the other person. True revenge is reclaiming your own life. I felt a strange sense of peace for the first time in years. Not triumph. Not satisfaction from punishing him. Just peace. The peace that comes from knowing the past no longer controls you. I realized the quiet truth of my power. It had never been about him. It had always been about me. About reclaiming my life, my choices, my confidence. About showing myself that I could survive betrayal without being destroyed by it. Over the following weeks, he tried to rebuild the bridges he had burned. I let him, quietly, observing his efforts without expectation. I no longer needed him to restore my world was already mine. Sometimes, I caught him staring at me with something I hadn't seen before. Respect. A recognition that I had survived, that I had grown, that I had reclaimed control. That realization was my victory, silent but complete. We were in the same house, sharing meals, sometimes laughing, sometimes sitting in quiet companionship. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was honest. And honesty, after deception, is worth more than perfection. True freedom doesn't come suddenly. It comes gradually, through awareness, choice, and the courage to act on it. I had chosen freedom. And it was the most powerful, liberating feeling I had ever known. Part 4. Consequences. The days after the reveal were surreal. He went through the motions of our life, but everything had shifted. I noticed the smallest changes, how he hesitated before speaking, how his hands lingered on objects as if he were testing them, how he glanced at me more often, perhaps searching for a trace of the old me he had thought he knew. I, on the other hand, was no longer the wife who feared. I was the wife who observed, calculated, and acted deliberately. I began making decisions entirely on my own, small at first. The route I took on a morning jog, the books I chose to read, the friends I invited over. Then larger decisions followed. Planning a weekend trip without asking him, pursuing opportunities for work I had long postponed, dedicating time to hobbies I had abandoned. He noticed. Of course, he noticed. At first, he tried to influence me, subtly, suggesting I reconsider plans, questioning minor choices, but I remained calm. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply acted in ways that made it clear. My life was mine, not his to dictate. I could see it in his eyes, the slow realization that control, which he had always taken for granted, was slipping. And I did nothing to stop it. One evening, he tried a small act of penance. He cooked dinner, cleaned the kitchen, and waited for my reaction. I smiled politely and thanked him, not because I needed his gestures, but because I wanted him to understand. My appreciation was not a currency to manipulate. He tried to talk about the future, cautiously, as if testing the waters. Can we rebuild? He asked. I paused. I looked at him. Calmly, I said, we can build something new. But it will be built on honesty. Not on fear, not on lies. He nodded slowly. He understood, though he wouldn't admit it aloud. The foundation of our relationship had shifted irreversibly. The old dynamics were gone. He could no longer take my trust for granted. I spent that night in quiet reflection. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of freedom pressing against my chest in a comforting way. I realized that the greatest consequence of his betrayal was not his guilt, it was the way it forced me to grow. To reclaim myself. To rebuild a life on my terms. I began to notice small changes in myself I hadn't expected. I walked taller, spoke more confidently, and allowed myself to enjoy moments of solitude without guilt. I stopped waiting for him to define the rhythm of my life. I discovered strength in silence, in observation, in deliberate choice. He tried to bridge the gap, but I let him take his time. He couldn't manipulate me anymore, couldn't coerce forgiveness or obedience. He was learning the cost of his actions, and I was watching, quietly, without interference. Occasionally, he would reach for my hand in the living room, seeking reassurance. I allowed it sometimes, but without the old submission. My response was measured, deliberate. He noticed. He understood that the woman he had once controlled was no longer available to him in the same way. And with that understanding came a subtle shift in him. Not immediate. Not complete. But he began to show glimpses of respect and caution. He chose his words more carefully, considered his actions, and began to understand that honesty was not optional anymore. The house, once a stage for his deceit, became a place of observation, reflection, and quiet assertion. I no longer needed confrontations, confessions, or dramatic gestures. I simply existed with confidence and clarity, and that alone changed the balance. I realized something critical. The real power after betrayal is not revenge. It is consequence. It is showing someone, through the undeniable reality of your life, that their actions carry weight. That you are no longer dependent on their choices. That your life continues, stronger, calmer, more deliberate, without them dictating its course. And as weeks passed, I began to feel something I had long forgotten. Peace. Not fleeting, not conditional on him, not dependent on the absence of guilt or apology. A steady, calm peace that came from knowing I had reclaimed my world, my choices, my dignity. Part 5. Freedom. Months had passed since the reveal, but nothing had returned to the way it was. The house remained the same, the routines unchanged, but everything had shifted. I was no longer the wife who feared, no longer the one who waited for his next move or questioned every glance. I was the woman who had reclaimed herself, and that alone transformed everything. He tried, in small ways, to restore a sense of normalcy. Apologies, gentle gestures, careful conversations, none of it could undo what had already shifted. He had learned a lesson I didn't need to teach with anger. Trust, once broken, cannot simply be rebuilt. It must be earned. And I had already moved beyond needing him to earn it. I continued my life fully. I pursued my passions again, writing, running, reading, and I let myself enjoy the things I had abandoned for years. I took trips I had long postponed, spent time with friends I had neglected, and focused on work that fulfilled me. Each choice was deliberate, a reminder that my life was mine, not his to control. I noticed subtle changes in him. He spoke more cautiously, measured his words, and showed a level of respect I hadn't seen in years. He understood, perhaps without admitting it, that the woman he thought he could manipulate was gone. That realization was quiet, subtle, but it carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. One evening, we sat across from each other on the couch. Silence stretched between us, but it was no longer oppressive. It was calm, comfortable, even intimate in its honesty. "You've changed," he said quietly. "I chose myself," I replied. He nodded, his eyes reflecting a mix of recognition and resignation. He understood, finally, that I would never be the same. That control, once lost, could not be reclaimed. That my life, my peace, my choices, were no longer his to dictate. And in that moment, I realized something profound. True power does not come from punishing another. True power comes from reclaiming your own life. I felt a deep, steady relief for the first time in years. Not triumph over him. Not satisfaction and revenge. Just peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you are no longer defined by someone else's actions. I reflected on the months that had passed, the choices I had made, and the person I had become. I had grown stronger, calmer, more deliberate. I had discovered joy in solitude, confidence in independence, and strength in observation. I was no longer the woman who waited, feared, or questioned every moment. I was free. Freedom, I realized, is not sudden. It comes through awareness, through reflection, through conscious choice. It comes from understanding the value of yourself, and deciding not to let anyone diminish it. I had chosen freedom, and that choice had transformed everything. He tried to bridge the gap sometimes, to reconnect, to regain a sense of the past, but I remained deliberate, patient, and clear. I let him see the life I had built without him controlling it. I didn't need to punish him or humiliate him. The consequences of his choices were already written in the way I lived my life, confident, unafraid, and unbound. Occasionally, he reached for my hand, quietly seeking reassurance. I allowed it sometimes, not out of need, but as a conscious choice. My response was measured. My trust had shifted, yes, but my autonomy had not. He noticed, and he understood. And that understanding, more than anything, marked the difference between past and present. The house, once a stage for deceit and manipulation, had become a place of clarity. My home was no longer a battlefield. It was a space of calm, reflection, and strength. I did not need confrontations, explanations, or dramatic gestures. My life, my choices, my peace, these were the ultimate statements. I realized something essential about revenge and betrayal. True revenge is not about hurting the other person. True revenge is about consequence. It's about showing, through your actions and your life, that their choices carry weight. That you are no longer dependent on their presence or their honesty. That you can thrive without their control. And as the weeks turned into months, I felt a kind of liberation I had never known. Peace that did not depend on apologies. Strength that did not rely on validation. Confidence that came not from being loved, but from loving and respecting myself. Finally, one night, I stood at the window, looking out at the quiet street. The lights of the city blurred like watercolors, and I felt the weight of years lift from my shoulders. I had survived deception, betrayal, and fear. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, my power. I realized the truth. The greatest inheritance from betrayal is not anger, not pain, not revenge, it is freedom. Freedom to be yourself, unbound by lies, unshackled from manipulation, and unafraid to choose your own path. I was free. Calm. Confident. Unshakable. And for the first time in a long time, I felt complete. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means a lot and helps me create more stories like this.